Today on Straight Talk Africa, the Zimbabwean military struck. Major General S.B. Moyo, the Army Chief of Staff, speaking on Zimbabwean Broadcasting Corporation, says President Robert Mugabe and his family are safe and sound, and their security is guaranteed. General Moyo says the army is targeting criminals around Mr. Mugabe who are committing crimes that are causing social and economic suffering in the country in order to bring them to justice. That's coming up next right here on Straight Talk Africa. Hello, welcome to Straight Talk Africa, live from the Voice of America studios here in Washington. I am Shaka Sali. Today, we are preempting VOA's special Boko Haram broadcast to take an in-depth look at Wednesday's unfolding political uncertainty in Zimbabwe. VOA's Boko Haram documentary, A Journey from Evil, will air at a later date. Zimbabwe's military seized the power early Wednesday, saying it was targeting criminals around President Robert Mugabe, the only ruler the country has known in its 37 years of independence. After nearly 4 decades in office, President Mugabe may have finally gone too far in firing his vice president and positioning his wife to succeed him. Zimbabwe's military says it is not carrying out a military takeover of the government and that both Mugabe and his family are safe. The Defense Force spokesman says they are focusing on individuals who are attempting to create havoc.
We are only targeting criminals around him who are committing crimes that are causing social and economic suffering in the country in order to bring them to justice. As soon as we have accomplished our mission, we expect that the situation will return to normalcy.
There are witness reports of at least 3 explosions and heavy gunfire in the capital city of Harare early Wednesday. The military is encouraging the public to restrict their travel unless necessary. The U.S. Embassy warned American citizens via its website to shelter in their residences and work from home on Wednesday. To learn more about the latest developments in Zimbabwe, we are joined on the telephone line from the capital, Harare, by Godwin Mungudia, VOA's Studio 7 reporter. Good evening, Godwin.
Good evening, how are you?
I am hugely terrific. Talk to us about the mood from your vantage point.
Well, the situation here in Harare is very calm. Early in the morning, with soldiers all over the city blocking some roads and preventing people from through these roads. But right now, as I speak to you, the army has scaled down operations, especially in the city center. They are allowing people to move about freely and, through some of these roads that were blockaded in the morning. And the city is usual, and most of the people that I talked to were very happy about the developments, but obviously there were some that were not happy about what was happening.
Now, I'm sure that, Godwin, you have met and interacted with a lot of people on the ground. What is the general impression? Are they happy? Are they celebrating? Or are they cursing the events of Wednesday?
My observation from the people that I've spoken to, most of them are generally happy. Remember, we have many young people here, and many were saying this is a good opportunity. They were thanking the army, for taking this bold move because they believe it gives them a chance to start a new life. Most of these young people have known only one president.
Now,
they blame it.
From what you seem to say, you seem to portray what, of course, the military is not saying, because the military is denying that it has carried out a coup Are you reminded of what happened back in 1974 in Portugal, the event that is called the Carnation Revolution, when the soldiers toppled the president and many women and men took flowers to soldiers who were driving tanks?
Yeah, well, I listened to the wedding by the army, and most people here are taking it as a coup, and they obviously welcome it, and it goes for none of them. I don't do that.
Godwin, can you hear me?
Hello?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
What are the headlines, or some of the headlines on Zambia Broadcasting Corporation television?
They are saying it's not a military takeover. They're saying the president is safe, the president's wife is safe, and we now have some youth from his ruling Zambia's party who had denounced the army commander, who are now saying they fully support him, they rally behind him. So that is what is happening now, and people are saying the ZBC, the Zimbabwe Broadcasting Corporation, is saying not a military takeover, but the military is just trying to control the situation. They're trying to deal with the malcontents surrounding the president, who are causing problems in the country.
Final question, Godwin, can you confirm for us the news that the former Vice President, Emmerson Mnangagwa, otherwise known as the Crocodile, is back in town, in Harare?
I can't confirm that yet, but that's what I've been hearing. I'm yet to confirm that, but that's what people have been saying. That's what I've been reading on social media. Apparently, we are told that this is what the sales forces want. They want him, to take over, or they want him to talk to President Mugabe so that they can find a solution. But at the moment, I have no confirmation as to whether he's back in the country or not. But there were rumors that he was coming from South Africa, aided by the South African government, coming to resolve the situation here in the country.
Godwin, this is the last question. If you were to talk to us from the deepest, better part of the bottom of your Zimbabwean heart and soul, how do you feel at the moment as you talk to me, given the events that are unfolding in your country?
I feel this is a very unique moment. I feel like people want change. This is the feeling that I get from whoever I'm talking to. This is the feeling that I get when I even talk to my family. I feel change has come.
I see. Well, on that note, Godwin, it was a pleasure interacting with you, and I wish you and your country and your countrymen and women the best that your country can endeavor.
Thank you very much.
You're most welcome, sir. Now, joining us here in the VOA studio are two distinguished guests. My colleague, Blessing Zulu, VOA Studio 7 reporter, and Dr. Kenneth Mwenda, Professor of Law, University of Pretoria in South Africa. Well, he was also, of course, a Rhodes Scholar at Britain's Oxford University. Well, gentlemen, I have to be honestly to say that I'm profoundly honored and exceedingly humbled to have the opportunity to host the two of you on Straight Talk Africa.
Thank you. Welcome.
My friend, my colleague, as a good Zimbabwean, what is your immediate reaction?
I think this came as a shock to many Zimbabweans, though, you know, it was bound to happen mostly because of the economic crisis and also, you know, the political temperatures in the ruling ZANU-PF were so high, and the firing of Emmerson Mnangagwa, I think we saw this coming, but you know, it was very fast, you know, because we all thought that Mr. Mugabe had the full backing of the military, you know, but you know, there are just a few tanks in Zimbabwe. No one, you know, is firing a shot at the army that is staging this coup. It's shocking indeed, this fall from grace of the president.
Given that President Mugabe has known Mr. Emmerson Mnangagwa since the mid-1970s, were you surprised, shocked that he could actually fire him?
I was not surprised because I think Mr. Mnangagwa and Mr. Mugabe, you know, they go a long way. 1976, you know, and Mnangagwa essentially calls Mugabe his father, so they had a very close relationship. But, you know, Mr. Mugabe's wife, Grace Mugabe, I think she was also aspiring to succeed Mr. Mugabe. I think that is where the problem started. And, you know, it was imminent, you know, that Mr. Mnangagwa was going to be given the boot by President Robert Mugabe.
We know, of course, the qualifications of Mr. Mnangagwa, otherwise known as, of course, the crocodile. But what about the qualifications of Dr. Grace Mugabe, a lady that has the distinction, apparently, the only one probably in the world, who actually earned a doctorate degree in sociology at the University of Zimbabwe within 2 months. And there is apparently no evidence of a dissertation in any archives, not in Annaba University, where the world's dissertations used to be kept, or actually at the archives of the University of Zimbabwe. Yeah,
so I think this was also an attempt to fast track yourself, you know, into becoming the president, because like you are saying, the PhD was done in a record time, and many people think that you know, she did not study for that PhD. She was just given to enhance a profile.
Was it some way of perhaps putting her in a situation where she could be a legitimate rival to a Dr. Joyce Mujuru, who at that time had been vice president and had actually studied, frankly, for her PhD? Indeed, because at that time Mujuru was seen as the threat. She was the vice president. Mnangagwa was a mere minister. And, you know, Mujuru ended up being fired and Mnangagwa taking that position. I'm sure that you've talked with a lot of people, Blessings, as you often do. What are people telling you from the ground in Harare and Bulawayo and elsewhere in Zimbabwe? I think the majority of Zimbabweans are worried. They don't know, you know, the military is not saying exactly what they want to do, because initially General Chiwenga was saying that they were doing this because they were not happy, because they were alleging that Mugabe was purging war veterans from the ruling ZANU-PF party. So it was not about the problems that the country is facing, but it was a power struggle within ZANU-PF. So now that there's this military takeover, the majority of Zimbabweans I'm talking to are saying there must be at least a transitional period. You know, they should bring other opposition players, Morgan Tsvangirai, Dumiso Dabengwa, and Joyce Mujuru, and church leaders, and form a transitional government to stabilize the situation. But from what Chiwenga was saying, it appears they just want Mnangagwa to take over from President Robert Mugabe. So it's uncertain. Complete perhaps Mugabe's term until the next elections in 2019? We hope so. 2018, that's when the next election is supposed to be held. But, you know, it's
once the military is involved, you don't know. This is unprecedented in the history of Zimbabwe.
Very interesting. You talk about General Constantino Chiwenga.
Yes.
We know that he basically became the commander back in 2004. What else really distinguishes him? What makes him tick?
I think the fact that he, like Mugabe, like Mnangagwa, like Joyce Mujuru, people who fought the rebel prime minister to quote Shaka, the rebel prime minister Ian Smith,
and of course,
in the 70s.
And of course, by extension,
Yes.
Bishop Abel Muzorewa
Yes.
of Zimbabwe / Rhodesia.
Indeed. So that is, you know, where he derives his power from. That he was an ally, you know, of President Robert Mugabe during the Liberation War. He was a senior commander during the war. So I think that is where he derives most of his power from.
Are you in a position to confirm whether indeed the crocodile, Mr. Mnangagwa, is back in town in Harare?
He was expected this afternoon at around 2 p.m. From South Africa, but we haven't heard much. But this is vintage Mnangagwa. That's how he operates, you know, like a crocodile. That's why he's actually called the crocodile, because, you know, he operates like that. He's a very quiet man, but dangerous at the same time. Yes, he is. He is.
Very interesting. When you say this afternoon, are you talking about this afternoon Washington time or afternoon Zimbabwe time?
Zimbabwe time, yes.
Very interesting. Now, talk to us, Dr. Mwenda. What about you? Your immediate reaction, really. After all, let's face it, you once belonged to the same bloc.
The Federation.
Rhodesia.
Of Rhodesia and Nyasaland, yes.
And in fact...
Zimbabwe was southern Rhodesia, Zambia was northern Rhodesia.
That is true. And you've also had an opportunity, in fact, to use some of the money that was extracted out of that empire belonging to Sir John Cecil Rhodes. You were a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford University.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Shaka. I think there are two schools of thought currently. We are seeing a lot of media reports on the internet, social media, and so forth. One school of thought is that there is a military coup in Zimbabwe. The other school of thought, which the military are actually advocating, is that it's not a military coup. They're just putting in place certain mechanisms to ensure that they get rid of criminals around the president. Now, from a sort of jurisprudence legal theory point of view, there are a number of things that one may look at. I wouldn't want to rush to confirm whether this is a military coup or not, but to look at some of the incidences and factors which are usually present when there's a military coup. Number one, you need the military to be in office to take over power. Number two, they have to be in effective control. The question is, are they in effective control? They are what we call pillars of support in any state machinery, the judiciary, the police, the defense. Do they have control of all these institutions? To me, it would be as if President Mugabe has just taken a sabbatical, is on leave. They've openly conceded that they are not usurping powers of the president. They are simply aiding or assisting the president in a situation, for example, where he can be incapacitated.
In fact, they continue, for example, to address him as His Excellency, the President, Comrade Robert Mugabe.
And the commander of the armed forces.
And the commander of the armed forces.
Correct.
But do they, in fact, take orders from him, from what you see?
Now, the other issue, Shaka, is that they are not operating within the confines of the Constitution. Because if you look at the Constitution, it's probably the vice president who should be deputizing the president, not the military.
Correct.
But in the event of a situation like this, is a very novel situation. Typically, military coups, when they happen in a flash of a moment. The Constitution is suspended, and quickly there's an announcement that there's maybe an interim government and so forth. But this hasn't happened in Zimbabwe. It's moving a little bit slow. So it's raising a lot of questions. What type of arrangement is happening or taking place in Zimbabwe? Southern Africa, as I've pointed out on this show previously, has had very peaceful transitions. I think President Mugabe pushed his luck too far in removing the vice president and trying to prop up credentials of his wife as a possible successor. That was a very risky decision that he took. And I think this is what has created all this mess.
You obviously, when you say Southern Africa, are you forgetting that Madagascar could probably be one of those
It's an island. It's an island. It's not on the mainland. It's an island, yes, but it's in the region.
But very interesting, when you talk about whether this is a military coup or not a military coup, what about the fact that we are using words like seizing power? When you talk about seizing power, as a lawyer, what does that mean? Doesn't that probably mean you have probably overthrown some sort of constitutional order?
Good question. There are two. We have to distinguish power and legal authority. De facto, they could have power, but de jure, by law, it still resides in President Mugabe. And we have to be very careful. And as I pointed out, the judiciary, is the judiciary with the military or with the president duly sworn in under the Constitution? Mm-hmm. I think these are very important jurisprudential questions that will generate a lot of debate. But one of the critical things to look at, if you're looking at a successful military coup, is to look at what we call the vision for tomorrow. Mm-hmm. There has to be unity across the country and mass participation for a successful sort of social movement to move into the next phase. The Zimbabwean case doesn't strike me as one which has a vision for tomorrow. What happens when we take over power? Mm-hmm. What are the arrangements? I don't think that question has been addressed. And in a lot of these type of situations, what will happen is that you may cross over. Quite rightly, President Mugabe steps down, but there might be chaos, people fighting for power, because there's no unity of purpose going forward.
It is very interesting that the soldiers of Zimbabwe may in fact be very smart and probably borrowing a leaf. Guess where? From the United States of America several years ago, when the United States, for example, could not describe the events in Egypt that overthrew President Morsi, a man, in fact, who probably the only person that was ever democratically elected in the history of Egypt. The American government could not call it a coup.
It's very possible. In international relations, sometimes you have to think strategically about investors. You don't want to scare investors. There's a donor community. Zimbabwe economy has been struggling. So you don't want to sort of create apprehension that there's chaos going on there. So the military, I think, could be acting strategically. We can't confirm, but they could be acting strategically, not to scare investors and so forth. But I think it will be interesting to see in the next couple of weeks or so how things will evolve and what the position will be for President Mugabe.
How do you respond to some people who are actually saying that maybe the strategy, as a matter of fact, is to bring back former Vice President Emmerson Mnangagwa, have the military meet with their commander-in-chief, President Comrade Robert Mugabe, and in fact persuade him to hand over power to Mr. Mnangagwa so that automatically Mr. Mnangagwa in fact serves the remainder of the presidential term of President Mugabe until elections next year.
When we reach that phase, clearly then there's no argument that's a military coup, because then the president doesn't have powers himself when we get to that stage. But at the moment, I think there's a lot of speculation. But if the military were to be in control and hold him at ransom to say, look, you need to cede power to Mr. Mnangagwa, definitely that is by all means a coup.
What about bringing in doctors? They could bring in doctors and they could probably check the president and say, this man is senile.
Well, that's under the Constitution. You can't call that a coup. That's under the Constitution. If you do that, in fact, that's a smart move. If you do that, you're working within the framework of the Constitution, allowing the vice president to take in, for example, in the event of a president dying, the vice president can step in to act. Most constitutions is the vice president. And I believe Zimbabwe is the case. We've had that in Zambia when President Mwanawasa died. Somebody who was vice president came in, stepped in.
Mr. Of course, Rupiah Banda.
Yes, exactly. We had that with Michael Sata. When he died, Guy Scott stepped in. So it's not unusual. But I want to believe that the good thing about Zimbabwe is we're not seeing violence. There's no violence. There's good enough evidence through the media reports that President Mugabe is safe and his family is safe, which we commend the Zimbabwean people for. Like I said, Southern Africa, we tend to do things in a much more constructive way. And I hope Zimbabwe will find a constructive solution.
Very interesting. What about you, Blessings?
You know, I think talking to the people who are organizing this, I think I would differ with him a bit and call it a coup. They really want Mr. Mugabe to leave power. You know, they are talking about a certain agreement that they made during the Liberation War. Of course, I was challenging them about this, but they are saying that they agreed that at some point Emmerson Mnangagwa is to take over from Mugabe. Although Mnangagwa, if you look at the ZANU-PF hierarchy, is not the most senior. There are many who have fallen by the wayside.
But he was the first vice president.
Not exactly. Remember, Mugabe has had 7 vice presidents up to now.
No, I'm talking about more recently.
More recently, yes.
Yeah,
but,
more recently,
because
he was a man in a position that people characterize as being a heartbeat away from the big Insharada, my friend, from State House.
No, we are going back to their claim that they made an agreement that there was a sort of a hierarchy. You know, one can
When
argue
did they
that,
make that agreement?
In the 70s.
Really?
But Mnangagwa, yes, that's what they are saying. That's what these guys are
At
saying.
the time, Mnangagwa was a special assistant to Robert Gabriel
Exactly.
Mugabe.
That's why we are challenging them. That's why, Chiwenga, the General Chiwenga, I think what he merely wants is for Mnangagwa to take over. Because remember, Joyce Mujuru was senior to Mnangagwa during the Liberation War. She's one of the very few commanders, women commanders.
Female commanders.
Yes, during the Liberation War. She was kicked out in 2014, and these war veterans said nothing.
And she has since,
Yes.
of course, founded her own political party.
Yes, and you have people like Rugari Gumbo, who were in the so-called Rechimrenga, the War Council. They were kicked out together with Joyce Mujuru in 2014, and nobody said anything, But now that Mnangagwa has been kicked out, all of a sudden the military is jumping in, the war veterans and everyone is saying this must stop.
Why should that be surprising, given that you know as well as I do that Mr. Mnangagwa at one time was Minister of Defense, Minister of Security.
Yes.
He was also, of course, Minister of Justice, Speaker of the National Assembly. He was also, I think, Executive Director General of the National Intelligence.
But unfortunately, he was holding those positions, but when it comes to being elected, he's not very popular in the party. In 2014, she actually lost to Joyce Mujuru.
Yes.
Because by then, you had to be elected by all the 10 provinces.
Correct.
Yes.
Correct.
I mean, he could not do that. And then he changed the constitution because he was the party secretary for legal affairs.
Right.
To say there is now one center of power.
Which is?
Mugabe alone will appoint his deputies and everyone. The only 3 people that are not appointed by Mugabe is, in ZANU-PF rather, is the president is appointed by the people, and then the Women's League boss, who is Grace Mugabe, that one is also appointed, and the youth boss. Everyone else in the party is appointed by President Robert Mugabe. So that's how Mnangagwa came in. It was not through an election, but he was appointed by President Robert Mugabe, having changed the party constitution.
As a matter of fact, when you say that, it proves pretty much that, in fact, Dr. Grace Mugabe was a very uniquely smart individual, because
Indeed.
that's what she has actually been saying.
Yes.
That power is with the President of the Republic.
Exactly.
And all these people are appointed by my husband.
Exactly.
And in fact, as recently as last week, out of the 10 provinces, I think I read that 9 provinces
Yes.
were supporting Dr. Grace Mugabe for
Exactly.
the vice presidency.
So that is where the problem is, that Mr. Mugabe's deputies are not appointed by the people, but they are answerable to him. Something that Mnangagwa, as the lawyer, is responsible for doing, because he knew that Mugabe was going to appoint him, because they were doing this to say there's a lot of factionalism within the party, so let Mr. Mugabe appoint his deputies. But unfortunately, factionalism has not ended.
Because he thought he was perhaps indispensable.
Indeed.
Very interesting, eh?
I know. I mean, the other question that one would ask is on political legitimacy. If Mr. Mnangagwa is not as popular as my brother says here, there's no critical mass of support compared, say, for example, to Mrs. Mugabe. The question is, for how long will he hold if he were to take over power?
Very interesting.
The problem now in Zimbabwe is, unfortunately, if you look at the opposition, because of the military, you know, the opposition is not able to campaign, for example, in the raw areas. So you look at Mr. Mnangagwa. In 2000, he campaigned in the Midlands province, Kwekwe town to be precise,
Right.
and he lost the elections. And you know what he did? He moved to the raw areas, you know, where
And
the
won.
opposition cannot, and won resoundingly, where the opposition is not allowed to campaign. So this is where the problem is that, you know, the army, yes, I don't know why Mr. Mugabe talks about the army interfering in politics, but if you look at all the ZANU-PF congresses, and everyone in the army attends the ZANU-PF congresses, and you have Chiwenga himself, right, in 2013, saying that I will not salute Tsvangirai if he wins an election.
That is correct.
Mugabe said nothing.
And in fact, during that coalition government, he never probably saluted him.
Indeed, he never. He
As the
said I
Prime
won't
Minister.
attend meetings that he'll be. And then you go back to 2008, there was the late General Vitalis Shinavashi. He also said, you know, as the army, for you to be the president in Zimbabwe, you have to be a war veteran.
Part of Chimulenga.
You know, this is to make sure that most of these guys in the opposition will never be president.
Right.
But Mr. Mugabe said nothing. You know, so the military has always been interfering in the politics of Zimbabwe, but Mr. Mugabe has not been saying much. You know, so it's not surprising that it has led to this coup down.
Why would you call that as is it interfering or intervening or something? I mean, let's face it, you are not talking about a national army here. You are in fact talking about an armed wing of ZANU-PF.
Right.
Isn't that correct?
Yeah, I think that's where the problem is, right? That Zimbabwe's independence came through the liberation war. So these are comrades, you know, that's what the Chiwengas and Mnangagwas were saying, that, you know, some went into the army, others chose
Yes.
politics,
Yes.
Yeah.
but
So they have a sense of really entitlement.
exactly.
Right. I mean, the situation in Zimbabwe is very reminiscent of what we used to find in one-party political state systems, where the military is not professional. It's
Yeah.
highly politicized. That's a Zimbabwean case, where the military is so much part of the state machinery, highly politicized. Yes, the military, the commander-in-chief is the president, but the military has to be professional. Look at
Indeed.
the most mature democracies. The military in the US, the military commanders can afford to issue an opinion which goes contrary to what the president thinks on certain policy issues. But in a situation where the military are in the president's pocket,
Exactly.
Right. So basically, you are really looking at the ruling party not really being separate or different from, for example, the state, really.
Indeed.
precisely.
So the two are fused
Yes,
here.
precisely.
And yet, politically,
Yeah.
they give the appearance that Zimbabwe, like a lot of other countries,
Right.
is a multi-party country, multi-party politics,
Right.
but in fact, they function on a one-party state
De facto,
template.
yes, de facto one-party state.
Very
the,
interesting.
the constitution says multi-party politics, but in reality, it's de facto
Very
one-party state.
interesting. So, tell us about this great man called Mugabe, because frankly, I know that here in the West, they regard him as an autocrat, as somebody who stole the land from the 4,500 white commercial farmers and ruined the Zimbabwean economy. And yet, when you talk to a lot of Africans, they celebrate this man. As a matter of fact, even when he comes to New York, these annual September UN General Assembly events, a lot of Africans are actually waiting to watch him on television, listening to what comes out of his mouth. What kind of person, really, is Robert Gabriel Mugabe. What makes him tick? We know, of course, that he was born around 1924.
24, yes.
He had his first degree from Fort Hare University in the early 50s in South Africa, and went to Ghana and was anointed probably by the Osajefo, Kwame Nkrumah, and got married to a beautiful freedom fighter called Sally
Heffron.
Sally Heffron Mugabe
from Ghana.
Yeah, from Ghana. In fact, from I think Coast Province actually of Ghana, and he's been in power since April 18, 1980. 7 years as a prime minister and the rest as president. What kind of person is he really?
I think
7 degrees, by the way, and
yes.
7 academic degrees. 3 of them while he was in detention in Rhodesia. And apparently he also boasted of another qualification. And he said he had a degree in violence. I don't know whether you have heard about that.
Yes, he said that. But, you know, the problem with Mr. Mugabe is that many people don't understand him. One thing that you cannot take away from him is he's very smart.
Very.
He's very smart.
Remarkably articulate.
Yes, he's a very powerful orator, you know. So, and he claims, you know, to be a Pan-Africanist. You know, this is why whatever he says.
What do you mean he claims?
I don't know. If you look at
He supported a lot of African countries which were waging, you know, liberation struggles.
But the problem is when you come to his domestic policies.
Correct.
You know, it's a contradiction.
A lot of those types of people are like that.
Indeed. So
you meet Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni, he tells you he's a Pan-Africanist.
Exactly.
But when you look at his domestic policy, you say, wait a minute.
Yeah. And some of the policies, you know, like the land reform program, it was not bad. You know, if you tell fellow Africans that there is need for land reform, everyone supports it. But so Mugabe goes out and says, you know, sanctions were imposed on my government simply because I took land from the few whites and empowered the blacks. Land reform, the majority of Zimbabweans supported, but unfortunately...
Did he, in fact, empower the blacks in
Unfortunately,
Zimbabwe?
he did not. He himself has more than 10 farms.
So
all his ministers have more than 10 farms.
So when he talks about empowerment, it is selective empowerment.
Exactly. So he's not very different from the whites.
Did you have to be a card-carrying member of ZANU-PF in order to have unfettered access to that piece of territory?
Unfortunately, yes. And the other problem with that land reform program is that, you know, you had black laborers, you know, who had been on the farms for years, you know, 40 years. So I think it would have been better if he had also empowered those. You know, they would have worked on the farms for 20, 30 years. They had that experience. Because remember, if you look at the history of Zimbabwe, the land reform started around 1908, you know, when the whites thought that there was gold in Zimbabwe. They didn't find gold, so they turned to land. So, but the majority of the whites failed, and the few that succeeded excelled.
But
so
they
you
found
had the same.
Kilom.
Yes. So you also had the same with the black laborers. You know, they were very good. They'd gone. I would think that the government should have empowered them, but unfortunately, they were not empowered. The majority of them went to South Africa, and some are in Zambia. Some went as far as Nigeria.
Zimbabwe's crisis, I think, kind of got more formalized as a crisis after the birth of ZANU-PF. Remember, there was ZAPU under Joshua Nkomo.
Joshua Nkomo, indeed.
Joshua
yes.
Nkomo was fighting from Lusaka, Zambia.
Yes.
That's where he was based. Mugabe was mainly operating from Mozambique and Tanzania.
Correct.
Okay. Now, when Nkomo was messed up, almost assassinated at some point, then eventually there was the birth of this ZANU-PF. That was now the birth of a one-party state in Zimbabwe.
And what about, of course, the rivalry between people like Mugabe and the late Reverend Ndabadingi Sitori?
Mugabe, you know, it was a coup of some sort. You know, it is the same. This is why these guys are saying we are the ones, you know, who put you in power, because they are the ones that led the rebellion against Ndabadingi and elevated Mugabe. So it's payback time. So they are saying, you know, now you are saying all this, but the majority of the war veterans were already in Mozambique, you know, in 1973, and Mugabe came later on, like 1976, you know, and then they elevated him, they kicked out Tabadingistoli. So, you know, it's a kind of a history, of course, if you look at the history of ZANU-PF.
Blessing, tell us a little bit about the good side of Mugabe, because in fact there's plenty of good side of Mugabe. Look at the educational policies, for example, in Zimbabwe. I think as a result of that, even up to now, Zimbabwe is arguably one of the most illiterate nations in Africa and indeed globally. What about at one time the healthcare policies and all that kind of stuff? Talk to us about that.
Yeah, indeed. I think the first years were very good for Zimbabwe in terms of the education. You talked about health.
The first 20 years.
Yes.
As a matter of fact, my first and last time to interview President Mugabe was in 2000 in New York City, when there was a special session on the war in the DRC. I got that interview courtesy of George Charamba and Wengweri at that time. I wonder where the two are right now, George Charamba and Wengweri.
Has left the government office, and Charamba remains the spokesperson and also presidential spokesperson. But interestingly, he backs Mnangagwa. So
really,
yeah,
very interesting. So, which means probably George Charamba, if you are watching this program or listening, you might in fact once again come handy and give me an unfettered access to the next Zimbabwean president, if that should be perhaps the crocodile.
Yes. So you asked about the good side. I think Mr. Mugabe has very good policies. I think the only problem mostly is the implementation. You know, black empowerment programs. He has introduced this program to say, if you want to come and invest in Zimbabwe, you must at least give 51% of your stake to the blacks. Fair and fine. But unfortunately, you know, it's only people who are around him. So the policies are good in terms of education, economic empowerment, but the implementation is where he has been lacking.
You know, it is interesting because I was reading somewhere and someone said, in fact, this is a leader of Zimbabwe's influential liberation war veterans. He said, it's the end of a very painful and sad chapter in the history of a young nation in which a dictator, as he became old, surrendered his court to a gang of thieves around his wife. Do you relate with that sort of observation?
Yeah, that's why I mean the war veterans were saying before there was this military coup, Grace had staged a bedroom coup, you know, to usurp power. And this is exactly what they are saying they are fighting against. So it's a military coup versus bedroom coup.
Well, you don't really need to talk about a bedroom coup. Let's face it, if you are somebody's wife or somebody's husband, frankly, you must have a unique position to influence that particular other significant party.
Indeed.
Because you will be the first person to see that individual and the last person to see that individual. Indeed. And why not? Well, you're tuned into Straight Talk Africa. To participate in our conversation, please call us at 202-619-3111. The US country code is 1. We'll continue our discussion in a moment, so please don't go away.
Today's youth are not just the next generation of African leaders, they are today's leaders. And this is the time to invest in them. Today, not tomorrow. So let's connect. Let's engage with each other on issues that will transform our societies. Innovation, leadership, entrepreneurship, things that you're doing to move the continent forward, to make you the greatest generation that Africa has known. It's Upfront every Wednesday, 17:30 UTC, right here on The Voice of America.
If you like today's show, please write and tell us what you think or give us some suggestions. Be sure to tell us what station you're tuned into. Our address, Straight Talk Africa, Voice of America, 330 Independence Avenue Southwest, Washington, D.C. 20237 USA, or send us an email at africatv@voanews.com. Log on to our website at voaafrica.com, or post your comments on Facebook. Keywords Straight Talk Africa.
Thank you very much, Esther Gizi Yuwat. And of course, this is Straight Talk Africa coming to you live from Washington. Let me come to you again. I'm sorry that I had to interject because, you know, there's no democracy in Studio 52. If your producer says you go for a break, you have to go.
Indeed.
No questions asked. It's just like being a loyal soldier on a parade square. Now, what sort of lessons, frankly, do you think that Africa can learn out of this very interesting experience, really, in Zimbabwe, Kenneth?
Yes.
You have a lot of other Africans presiding over the same conditions, really, as we talk.
Yeah. If you look at the history of military coups in Africa, particularly, we've had elsewhere, you know, Asia and so forth, but in Africa particularly, most military coups have been very violent. A few have been peaceful. So if and when this does turn out to be a military coup, we want to commend the Zimbabwean people for having gone the non-violent way.
Yes.
No life has been lost so far from the reports.
Yes.
And that's a very civilized way of doing things, although it's unconstitutional.
That is very interesting. In fact, there are more people who have actually been killed during elections in Kenya. And elections, frankly, at least the democratic elections, you expect this to be the moral equivalent of a wedding, not a funeral.
Right.
But you have not had reports about people being killed in Zimbabwe.
Yes, the Zimbabwean people have shown a lot of political maturity. This thing has been going on for a long time. In other countries, you would have people fighting from the bush already.
That is
It
correct.
has not happened in Zimbabwe.
Nigerian coups used to be
It never happened.
relatively...
It never happened in Zambia 27 years. People were fed up, but we went by the constitution. The Zimbabweans waited until the very last moment when they were pushed to the edge. I think other democracies in Africa, especially Francophone countries, need to learn something.
But you probably wouldn't refer what is going on in your country, really, as being democratic, because let's face
It's a different
when
question.
I was in Lusaka, I mean, I have to be honest with you, there was so much tension, so much that you could probably even cut it with a knife or a spear.
Right.
People are saying, what happened? Because let's face it, Zimbabwe used to be one of the beacons of hope, frankly, for African democracy.
Yeah, what you're saying in Zambia, the Zimbabweans are likely to go through that. For a long time, we had President Kaunda. The institution of presidency was a myth until Kaunda left office. So now every chancer, every lightweight character wants to form a political party, thinks he can be a president. The presidency has been cheapened. That's the expression I'm going to use. So you find a lot of unworthy characters trying to line up for the presidency. It's going to happen in Zimbabwe.
Interesting. Now, Blessings, I know that probably there's no one that has covered Zimbabwe as closely as you have. Tell us, again, I'm talking about what lessons should Africans learn from the experience, really, of Zimbabwe. You have, again, situations comparable in many, many African countries. What is it that you would call or characterize President Robert Mugabe? We know that, of course, he was, quote-unquote, one of those people who fell under the category of we hold, quote-unquote, periodic elections.
That's where...
Even though these elections were probably neither free, fair, transparent, credible, or verifiable. Some of these elections, in fact, the results did not reflect the will of the people. The results reflected the will of who counted the vote or who announced the results.
Indeed.
What do you say to some of these leaders in Africa who can be compared to really his particular situation? Because what do you call Mugabe then? Because, yes, he basically was an elected president, obviously with an asterisk. But can you, in fact, call him a dictator?
Yes, I would. You have to call him that. And of course, one of the major lessons here is that, you know, Mr. Mugabe is 93. And they say if a corpse stays for too long, it will chase away mourners. I mean, at 93, you have been in power since 1980. If he was to contest next year, because he had already been endorsed by the party, he will be 94. The term ends when he's 99.
Yes.
There's a problem there. But most fundamentally, it's okay if you are elected by the people. But like you are saying, most of the elections now in Africa, it's what we call electoralism. You know, it's just a ritual to say you are going for elections, but you know they are rigged. So the problem now is, if people don't believe in democracy, you know, most Zimbabweans are resigned. Now they were trying to register people to vote out of a population of 13 million. They are struggling. You know, they said we want to register 7 million. They are struggling. Now they're about 2 million, and the registration closes next month. People don't believe in elections anymore because they will just say they are rigged.
They don't mean anything.
So if people don't believe in elections, there will be coups.
Then they are not,
You know?
they are not elections.
Yeah, so
they are probably selections, or
exactly.
probably
So
call it
if,
another name.
Yeah, if I wouldn't say that we must have term limits. It's okay if you want to rule for 30 years, as long as you are democratically elected. So make sure the environment is free and fair, and then, you know, people can believe in the system.
That's very interesting. That brings in fact, my question about the stand or the position of the African Union and indeed the international community. Because right now, the African Union is warning the soldiers of Zimbabwe to make sure it is not a coup, because a coup is not acceptable, which is a good thing. What about the fact that African dictators have become very smart recently, to the extent that they no longer need, in fact, to use an AK-47 to either seize power or stay in State House? Basically, all they do now is make sure they rig, they steal an election. What about the fact that the African Union really and the international community should now get into the business of looking at these dictators or leaders who change constitutions, which they swear to defend, to uphold and protect? That in fact, if there is a major constitutional amendment, it should not benefit that incumbent president. And or if a president changes the constitution for what is seen to be personal or political gain, he should not be recognized internationally. What about that?
Thanks, Shaka. There is, in political science, the concept of the Westphalian concept of a nation state.
Right.
Which proceeds on the basis that a state is an entity and there's no need for interference in the domestic affairs of a state from outside. So a lot of African states want to utilize that old Westphalian model because we're under globalization now. The world has changed. The landscape has changed. We can no longer operate under the Westphalian model. You know, it's a globalized world. International relations, it's interconnected. But I think what's really critical, even for Zimbabwe, is, and for the region, Sub-Sahara, Southern Africa region, one thing that is very characteristic of that region is populist leaders. Look at South Africa. Look at Michael Sata, Zambia. You know, those type of populist leaders. I hope and pray that Zimbabwe doesn't go for a populist leader. What you need is quality leadership. The West Africans are providing good role models of quality leaders in recent times.
Correct.
You can see the type of leaders that they are selecting. They're not picking people who are just, you know, dancing in the streets or drinking, you know, the local brew.
You
know?
also saw, of course, how ECOWAS solved the political crisis in the Gambia.
Right. Now, for African Union, I wouldn't say I sympathize, I rather I empathize. I really understand where they're coming from. It's more of AU is a political organization, not an economic organization, but so there are politics involved there.
And it has no sovereign status.
That's the whole thing.
But it gets into the business of saying, if you seize power with a gun, we are not going to do business with you.
Right.
So why can't they also come up with a policy sincerely of saying, if you change a constitution under your watch,
yes,
we are not going to do business with you?
Yeah, ideally, you're absolutely right, Shaka. You've got a good point. Ideally, people would want to see that, but you have to understand also the political culture on the continent. We have young democracies, which are not more than 40 years old, 30, 40 years old.
Yeah.
Some of the things that we are going through, some Western countries have been through them.
Yes.
So we are learning.
No, I understand. But let's face it. I mean, there are a lot of other countries that seem to know what is happening because, after all, let's face it.
Yes.
The majority of problems probably point to the weakness of we as individuals especially the educated elite. Because let's face it, the intellectual balance of power has been shifting in our favor.
And also the other thing is the institutions, the governance institutions that we have in place, the electoral commissions,
Yes.
and so forth. They are highly politicized and compromised. And therefore you find that some of these things like rigging elections are a cup of tea in a number of these countries.
But again, surely, let's face it, the international community should not do business with the people they know have stolen their people's vote. If you have a situation that is very clear, and there are so many really situations that are very clear, that the results of such an election is not a reflection of the will of those people or the people who came to vote.
It's a very risky and dangerous path for the international community to tread if they were to go in that direction. The people who benefit from trade relations, aid, donor aid, are not necessarily the bureaucrats. They may get some money out, but the common people on the ground, health sector, education sector, the poor will suffer. It will be worse.
So what about the fact that people like Robert Mugabe, for example, the late brother leader, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, people like Ugandan Yoweri Museveni, people like Paul Biya, people like Paul Kagame, and all these people actually say that they are freedom fighters. That they are freedom fighters to such an extent that freedom fighters cannot be removed from power with a piece of paper. That these are people who are uniquely gifted in their communities to such an extent that they are like God's gifts to their countries, really. Do you really think there is such a thing?
Yeah, I mean, I was fortunate to meet brother leader Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, Tripoli. I did some work for the government of Libya, so I still remember my meeting with Gaddafi. A very charismatic man, and when I traveled to Libya, Libya was a fairly developed country. Now, there's a question in the social sciences.
Was that development really or economic growth?
Development is really defined by economic growth and social change, two things. So economic growth was definitely there. The question of social change is a different one. Now, the point that I'm trying to make is that really if you look at economic growth and statistics on the ground, GDP and so forth, these guys are pushing the frontiers. But from a governance point of view, you're absolutely right. Power corrupts and absolute power corrupts, absolutely. They start off very well, including our heads of state after independence. They started off very well. The intentions were genuine. But along the way, you know, it gets to their head.
My brother, you know, there was this American preacher, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who once said that injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere.
That's true. That's correct.
Very interesting.
Yes, I remember very well visiting Martin Luther King's childhood home in Atlanta. I don't know if you've been there.
Yes,
and his grave where he's buried. A very charismatic leader he was. But absolutely, Martin Luther King was right. Look, we are not defending African presidents. A wrong is a wrong.
Yeah, but I think that we should stay away from this myth of these individuals who are uniquely gifted so much that perhaps their countries wouldn't stay if they lost power.
But there's also the argument that Africans, we tend to be too critical of our own systems sometimes.
That's true, but unfortunately, time happens not to be our best ally. On that note, thanks to our two distinguished guests, my colleague Blessing Zuru and Dr. Kenneth Mwenda. Thanks to our affiliate stations, along with our viewers and listeners. For many of our Voice of America radio affiliates, Learning English is coming up next. And tomorrow morning, Daybreak Africa with James Bate. On behalf of the Voice of America, thanks for tuning into Straight Talk Africa. In the meantime, get better, not bitter Zimbabwe. And please remember to keep the African hopes alive.